Welcome to another session of Juxtapositions, the lecture series of the Studium Generale at the Berlin University of Arts. This time, for the first time, remotely and solely online. My name is Lukas Feireiss, and as part of my visiting professorship, I aim to provoke and to inspire a broad cross-disciplinary discourse within and beyond the school. So on a weekly basis, this lecture series, Juxtapositions, invites an eclectic group of international artists, designers, curators, architects, and writers to share their work and world with us. And with Juxtapositions, we try to bring across the notion that none of the issues that we are facing globally right now can be tackled by a single profession, but through deliberate collaboration. And all of the talks are on our website now. So if you missed any of the previous talks, you can go to the UDK Juxtaposition website and find the link to the talks. That said, I would like to introduce today's guest. Sharona Franklin is joining us remotely from her kitchen in Vancouver, Canada. Good morning to you, Sharona.
Good morning. Thank you for joining me in my home. This is where I work and practice. Yeah.
Thank you for letting us in. So actually, Sharona, we were introduced to each other via Matilda Tchaikovsky, who spoke here 2 weeks ago to the class. And I was in conversation with Matilda, and I told her about the class, or the series of lectures that I'm preparing here for the University of Arts. And she immediately said, "Oh, I just met this amazing artist, Sharona. I think you should definitely invite her." And then I looked at your work, and I immediately fell in love with it. So here we are now, a couple of months later, me in Berlin, you in Vancouver, and you're part of this lecture series. So thank you to that. I'm really super thrilled to have you with us today, because also you represent what this whole course is very much about, namely the refusal of a disciplinary coherence, and also an engaged, creative, and critical practice beyond, let's say, standard protocol, and definitely outside the given norms and forms. So thanks again for being with us.
But thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And before you start, let me now briefly introduce you to our online audience. So you work as a multidisciplinary artist, writer, and a disability advocate, and you experiment with multiple mediums, and multiple materials to help, as you call it, deprogram internalized ableism, and also to re-envision our environments and communities working away from able centricity. So I'd say it's also about raising awareness for the social construct of disability, and maybe also pointing out tensions and contradictions in our contemporary world. And you have also coined a lot of terms around which your work evolves, which you maybe will kind of elaborate a little bit further, some of them being radical healing methodologies, and cybernetic craft, and bio-ritualism, and social independence. So I'm very curious to maybe hear some more about these. And your work, as I said, is multidisciplinary and very, very broad, but it's always it seems very tactile and very versatile. So multiple materials come into play. For example, from these decomposing and edible sculptures, hence we're also sitting in the kitchen, one of your main working areas, textiles, scents, and digital memes, a project that you worked on extensively a couple of years ago. But there's also poetry and lectures and photos and print publications. So it's a wide range of mediums. And speaking of publications, you have also been extensively published in the last years, ranging from the New York Times to the BBC and the Guardian to also, Vogue, Hypebeast, and Pinup magazine. So you kind of covered the entire field from left to right and right to left. And this year you had your first European solo exhibition in Brussels called Axioms of Care. And You participated also in the current group exhibition at the Museum for Moderne Kunst in Frankfurt called Crip Time, curated by Susanne Pfeffer. And currently you're working on your second US show. The first was in New York, called New Psychedelia of Industrial Healing. And the second solo show will be at the MIT List Center at the end of February and of next year. So thanks again for being here, and welcome, Sharona Franklin, and I'll pass the mic to you now.
That was a really thorough introduction. I appreciate it. I couldn't have done that for myself, so thank you. Yeah, right now I'm working on, I can give a little update. I'm working on a project with Elephant magazine. So that's kind of exciting. It's a creative project too. It's not just an interview. I wish I could give more details. That's something I'm really excited about. And some of the advocacy work that I'm doing right now is some of it's a bit DIY. Like, I've been making these Craigslist ads for accessible housing, like making joke ads and fake ads, just because online housing ads for rentals don't often speak about accessibility. So we often have to like disclose our disability barriers before we can even get a viewing, which leads to discrimination and people not wanting to rent or view, like, you know, choose us to view to. So I've been making kind of jokes, and I've been working on an article. I'm mostly just working on the show with MIT. There's also a group show at Cooper Cole and another group show at in Windsor with Amanda Cascia as the curator. And there's actually another smaller group show in New York this December called Slow Life. So keep an eye out for those. I'm really excited to be part of like these group shows because yeah, I'm just excited to meet people. Like, through the pandemic, I've been so isolated. I haven't met anyone in like 2 years, so that's cool. I think working as an artist, like independently, I'm just always by myself. So I'm really grateful to be here. And although I can't see everyone on the screen, I see everyone's names. So hopefully there'll be some connections after the talk as well.
Yeah, and I also just saw on the Zoom, we have a maximum of 100 people listening, actually. So for the other students, they will be watching via the public streaming link. So there's actually even more than what we see here. Cool.
And I have a little puppy here. So if you guys hear some sounds, that's what's happening. It's a little dog. Yeah, so I'm going to get started with a kind of a slideshow PDF. Just one moment. Yeah, so this is my little intro. I have a lot of slogans. I really love silk screening. I find it physically really challenging, but I get help, or sometimes I outsource the labor. But designing stuff, I have a lot of fun. And because there's not a really long lineage of pop culture about disability, I find it even more fun because there's just so many possibilities still. And a lot of, like, my friends who are disabled artists are kind of like paving new paths in this kind of pop way, which I think is really important for disability, because pop culture being a bit more mainstream than like high fashion or high art, whatever those are. But like, you know, these kind of avant-garde realms are super cool, and I love thinking that way and creating that way, but I also really love simple pop art because it's more accessible to everyone. So in my practice, I really work with accessibility in different mediums and different styles of writing, different textures of things. I make cakes, I make sculptures out of paper mache, sometimes I make wood sculptures. This is a recipe that I made for lime flower jelly. And this is a project I did with printed matter. So there was a sculptural component to this, and a video, and a print component, and then this is a little free PDF that's on their website that you guys can download if you'd like. And it kind of talks about this idea of metempsychosis and the concepts of veganism in natural healing, and how veganism isn't really a one-size-fits-all. It's, better for the environment, but for a lot of people with degenerative diseases or digestive disorders, it can be very difficult to digest plants. And a lot of us in my peer group with chronic degenerative diseases and myself take medication that is created through stem cell technology and through transgenic medications that use both animal cells and human cells to create antibodies. So I used to be really interested in Pythagoras and research a lot about Pythagoras because he created the Pythagorean spiral, and all of those equations were used and are being used now in realms of science that he wouldn't have approved of. He was like a staunch vegan, and he had a lot of philosophies that were similar to Buddhism, but I often think about him because he's a really good example of how information is extracted from a being and it's being used to produce specific things in medicine and technology. But a lot of people don't think about Pythagoras and think, oh, the occultist, or oh, the theologian. They just think of the scientist, because that's what's profitable, and that's the profitable story in which people can proliferate his identity and gain from it. A lot of his theological perspectives aren't easily profited from. So I talk a little bit about that in here. This is just like a little homage to my childhood. I grew up with physical illness and mental illness, and I lived in many, many different homes, and I eventually was in the social system. And I don't know how that is in Germany, but in Canada, it means you're taken away from your parents and you have social workers, your home's always inspected, things like that. And I had a lot of siblings. I had 7 siblings. There were 8 of us, and most of my siblings were anarchists, one of which robbed a bank and went to jail, and they were all artists. So these are drawings from when I was young, a little anarchy, and sometimes it pays to be different. I think I was like 9 or something when and then the reality that life is hard sometimes and depression is real no matter what age you are. There's a picture of myself when I was I think I was 9 or 10. And then these are from my 20s. I'm 34 now. But these are some kind of party flyers that I made. I used to make party flyers because I was always sort of in and out of the hospital, and I couldn't get out a lot. So friends who knew that I liked to make things would just email me or phone me and be like, oh, make this poster for this party. And I didn't go to very many of these parties, if any. But yeah, I went to a few, but I made probably 100 posters, and that was a really healthy way for me at the time to not have to necessarily speak about my body, but still get to use my body and my brain for something. Because I find with art, it's often so intrinsically connected to our subjectivity. But in this way, in designing or just drawing, I got to connect with others and not have to face my subjectivity in that way. Sorry. I have a collection of sticks and twigs here because that's what I work with, and my dog really loves them. He also loves gelatin. So he's making noises because he wants my twig that's on the wall that's dry. This is a manual that I've been working on, and some friends helped edit it and make this little compilation for me, but I had to put it on the back burner a bit. It's such a huge project. But yeah, it's called Axioms of Care, a self-activating manual. It's specifically for people with disabilities. I think one of the hardest things growing up with mental illness and chronic disease and physical disability was that every self-help or positivity lecture book, it wasn't really focused on my barriers. Most of them spoke oh, wake up and make your bed and go for a jog. Well, for most people with chronic illness, our first task is, how are we going to get out of bed? What device are we going to use to get up? What medications are we going to take to get going? So this book, I'd really like to create kind of an open-ended manual where it prompts the reader to ask themselves questions and answer questions on their own goals based on their needs that week or month or year. And it can kind of track that. And then there'll be like poetry, like these care axioms or some axioms I wrote. To care, one must be careful. To provide true care, one must predict precarity. Part of the project is disseminating the word care, which is so often conflated with admiration, lust. Like people say, oh, I really care about this band, but they're not caring for the band. They just admire, and actually that's where a lot of things like sexual assault happen, is when there's this word care being used, but it's actually lust or admiration. And I think that the word care needs to be brought back to a safer place where people actually take the time to learn what care means to each person, because it's not a one-size-fits-all word. So this is also the title of my recent show at Lambda 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 at La Maison des Rendezvous in Brussels. And so these are a little bit more like snippets from the book, like 10 tips for working with disabled artists and talent. Just asking consent, being open, letting us know what you can offer and what your limitations are, being really realistic about what those limitations are if you're working with an institution or organization. Nothing about us without us is really important, since so many people with chronic illness and disabilities are infantilized and also isolated simultaneously and excluded from the institutional norms or educational norms or even workplace norms. We therefore have less opportunities in society, in person, to represent ourselves. And that's mirrored in the pharmaco-industrial complex, where decisions are being made about our bodies for our bodies without our input, and as well as the medical system, the bureaucratic system. Most systems of accommodation and accessibility aren't created by people with disabilities. So the Nothing About Us Without Us movement really, it kind of honors the opinion and thoughts of people with disabilities and the lived experience. Yeah, and these are just like some examples of the contents. This is an old zine that I made. It's just a little snippet on orphan drugs. Orphan drugs are a term for pharmaceuticals that are either like appropriated for another illness that they're not created for, or there's just very few people on the planet who need them. So when you live with rare disease, like I have a few different quite rare diseases, and then I have some more common ones. But the rare diseases, what happens is there's such a small pharmaceutical market for treatment that very little research, resources, and testing goes into those treatments. So it can be really risky. And for the most part, for lots of rare diseases, there's no drugs developed, therapy or organ rejection drugs or all these random things, and they kind of just throw really common medications at rare diseases. So it can be really confusing as a kid when you're taking all these different pharmaceuticals, anti-malarials, all these things for diseases you don't have. And that's something, as I grow older, now that I have the capacity and language and ability to research online, I'm like learning about these specific aspects of why it was maybe so confusing for myself, and probably still is for so many kids growing up with rare diseases. This is a book I made, I don't know, maybe 6-7 years ago. I can't really remember, maybe even longer. Rentalbog. And then this is a little pamphlet. This is a PDF. This is actually on Printed Matter's website as well. And so this is just like a Disability 101. And it has lots of resources, so you can go there and download it. This is a little example of a sticker. Like I said, I just really like to make things that are accessible to all different age groups. And, even like that's an easy thing for someone to graffiti who maybe doesn't have mobility in their hands, they could just like, you know, get someone to smack a sticker up somewhere on a ball or something. And then this exercise against able normativity. This is from a new book that I've been working on called Survival Repose, which is just a small selection of poems and I guess contemplative exercises. So the exercise goes like this. If you're not mobility impaired or use assistive devices, try explaining this to each person throughout the day. Oh, sorry. My dog is eating my cane. It's funny. He gets jealous when I'm on the phone. He just ate my cane. No, can't eat that. He has a bone right there. Okay, so the exercise would go like this. If you go to a store, you say, "Hi, excuse me, sorry to bother you. I just want to let you know and thank you. You don't have to help me with that item in the store because I'm not mobility impaired. I'm not vision impaired, and I can stand and lift my arms on my own." That might seem like really silly to some people, but about 90% of the times that I go in stores, I have to let people know that I need help, and I have to do it as graciously as possible. And it just gets really tiring. Even if people are kind, just to have to disclose things about your body to a stranger and rely on strangers around you to help you navigate through public places can be challenging. So the next exercise is just on the phone. "Hi, excuse me. I'm calling to let you know you don't need to explain where the washroom is, how the entrance works, or how wide the hallways and doorways are before I come to your business, because I'm not mobility impaired and can navigate architecture on my own. Thank you." So like the amount of phone calls I spend in a week just trying to figure out how I can exist, and same with friends. Like sometimes friends will phone for me, or my other friends who are disabled will do this, and it's just a whole world of labor and an economy of labor that's not really acknowledged. So I have a whole series of these exercises against able normativity, and some of them are in dating or friendships or employment relationships. So those are going to go in the book. And then this is going back to the Axioms of Care. These are 2 rugs that I made for Lambda Lambda Lambda. And I really wanted to make something that spoke to children with disabilities, because most kids with disabilities don't like understand that they're disabled, B, know how to process what's happening in a verbal way or an explicit way, you know, or feel safe enough to speak about it publicly. So most of the people I know who grew up disabled are only now able to process it. And some people will question like, "Oh, Sharona, why do you talk about the past?" Or, you know, "You're a disabled adult now." But I still don't really see my disability associated with adulthood. It's something that I associate with childhood that never went away. So that's kind of like, might be hard to understand. But yeah, I really associate disability with childhood because that was my introduction to it. And when I watched pop culture growing up, there weren't examples on how to be an adult with chronic disease or disability in pop culture. So I always thought like my experience with disability was my own as a child, but as I got older, it would either have to not exist to be like people in movies or people in television or people in magazines, or the world would have to change. And luckily the world is changing, but there's still a lot of slogans and hang-ups like, "We don't care the gender as long as they're healthy." I know that's such a well-meaning slogan, and it really just means that people wish well on others and themselves, which is great, but it doesn't leave a lot of room for kids who hear that all the time. There's different ways that could possibly be said. And it also speaks to the fact that some people think the worst thing possible isn't the gender, it's the illness, you know. And I think that just growing up ill and being told that I was living the worst experience possible is a really negative message to send to kids. And some people, like, I totally understand it's not so literal, but I think that it's something to be addressed at least, and to have people question how many times they said that. Maybe they said it around someone who's not healthy. And then the other one, all any parent wants is a healthy baby. And that's kind of addressing the lack of education and support for parents with children with disabilities. I think that a lot of government supports, at least in Canada, they're accessible to those who understand how to access them. But you know, for people who don't understand how to navigate bureaucracy, it doesn't help if there's bureaucratic structures in place. There needs to be more community awareness, I think, and just like ground level humanity awareness, and not these like formal institutional places that people have to know how to access and get involved with. So all any parent wants is a healthy baby. It also addresses the rates of abuse. Like, disabled children experience so much abuse just because oftentimes the parents don't have support networks around them, and they hear messages like, all any parent wants is a healthy baby, and they feel cursed, or they feel like they're overwhelmed with the fact they didn't get that. You know, their friends have a healthy baby, or their sister has a healthy baby. What's wrong with them and their baby, you know? So just kind of like talking about it in a different way, where it doesn't need to be a curse. It can be like, living unhealthy can just be a different way of living if you really learn to embrace it and accept it. It's, I think, for like what I hear from a lot of my friends too, is that the stigma and the shame and the discrimination is so much worse than the disabilities themselves. So that's kind of what I was going for with this. And then, okay, this is going back. Yeah, so this is in the show. This is a bone, and this is a little medical tie, and this is diclofenac, which is linked to the diclofenac vulture crisis. It's also an anti-inflammatory that they've prescribed me since I was little, and they prescribe a lot of people, but it's banned in certain kinds of vultures. It's killing all sorts of animals to the point of extinction. And this is an assistive fork. And then this is a drawing that I did in the 90s. It wasn't dated, but I thought it was kind of funny to include like the time, and like on one side there's the arm wrestle award and the basketball, but no one's playing with it, and then there's a wheelchair, and then there's this little book through the door. I don't know, I found it and thought that it kind of reminded me of the work that I put in this show, and just these objects in a room of accessibility. Yeah, and then here's a cane that I made out of gelatin. So this goes back to my gelatin work. I haven't fully introduced it yet, but I make a lot of decomposing sculptures out of gelatin, and I sometimes use potassium sorbate to preserve them. This one has some potassium sorbate. So the ones with potassium sorbate, they don't decompose at the same rate. They'll eventually maybe decompose, but I use a lot of botanicals. I use expired supplements. Part of my practice is utilizing what's around me, and I often have extra pharmaceuticals I can't use, and I think, oh, I don't want to just dispose of these. Like, I'm going to put them in a sculpture and give visibility to what's going on inside my body, inside other people's bodies. Okay, this is this is a view of what it looks like to practice in a domestic space with a disability. So this is like one of my, I've lived in 3 places since I'm really trying to find somewhere healthy and safe and accessible for me to live, but I haven't been able to. Not yet anyways. This is my last place on the left. This was a couple years ago, actually. This was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was just this tiny room, and I had to make my quilt. That's a quilt that I showed at Kingsley, but I made it right next to my bed. And each image on the quilt is a new psychedelia bio-ritual. And what I did was I took an assemblage and did a meditation every evening with my genetic treatment, my injections, and I took these photographs and then I printed them on fabric. And the project was called New Psychedelia of Industrial Healing, and then I quilted them. But as you can see, there was very limited space. So, and then the plinths that I make are out of paper mache. And this is my current, on the right, this is my current place. So I've been trying to dry my sculptures in this little boiling room area. And then I tried to build a dehydrator because I'm kind of innovating my practice. Like I am really modeling it after my own research, and I don't know how, there aren't really devices to do what I'm doing, or at least devices that I know of or could afford. So I tried to make this dehydration tunnel. There's a massive zipper, and then it has this big dehumidifier, but I can't lift it, so I have to like get people to come and lift it and empty it. There's a rodent issue, which isn't great for gelatin, and then there's also a waste removal issue. So I kind of wanted to just be like super honest about the behind the scenes unglamorous side of the work, because I know my work often looks like jewels or, you know, these precious things, which they are, but the making of it can be pretty messy, and just wanted to be really realistic about what that looks like. Here it goes back to a bit of my text work. So it ain't care if it ain't careful. This is again linked to the book that I'm working on. And for a lot of the time when I read this, I think about, you know, ICE detainees in so many contexts. There's a claim of care, but then there's people injured, there's people starving, there's people lost. To be caring, you have to be careful. I think that should be 101. And then these are just some other text works that I've done. Some of them were, this one's in Rental Bod, and it reads, when a plant loses its ability to hear itself exist, it will emit gases and resonate at a louder frequency until it's able to sense itself again. And that I've learned about, and it kind of reminds me of activism and advocating for yourself, that you almost have to be at a place of suffocation sometimes, and then you can finally find your voice. That's how I felt, because I didn't advocate for myself publicly, or I didn't speak about disability publicly for about the first like 27, 28, 29 years of my life. I slowly started doing that. And then this is the Stop Rent graphic that I made. And so this is more work with the new psychedelia. These are spoon mandalas that I made that were shown at Lambda Lambda Lambda. And a little like bit of prose from me goes, Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine, but our med's a sin. What harms us can also heal us. What heals us can also harm us. So because there's such a lack of disability pop culture, and there's such a stigmatization of people who take pharmaceuticals, I created these with the bio-rituals, the images of the bio-rituals, and I made them into these little spoons. And then I made these mandalas to reflect our sense of time, the psychedelic sense of time while you're sick and while you're medicated. And so some of these prescriptions are real, and some are carved out of bone, and some are carved out of wood. And then in the ends are photographs. Excuse me, sorry. The ends are photographs that I took, and then I kind of epoxied them on. Here's more install views of the space. And I really wanted it to have the effect that the walls were climbing up, or the floors were climbing up the walls, and this kind of like really uncomfortable feeling, because I feel like that's the experience of being ill so often as well. It's just like all the walls are moving and things kind of seem okay, but they're not. Here's more of my gelatin work and some neurological meds and some juniper berries. A lot of the things that I put in there are just foraged or found. I really like to use recycled materials whenever I can. aside from the gelatin being a byproduct, I often don't really buy supplies aside from the gelatin and the preservant. So these are all old pharmaceuticals and just pieces of hardware that I found. Yeah, this is just a little intro of disability in production. For myself, production takes so much planning, basically planning and then failing, because I have to plan for that unpredictability. So basically I have to rest a lot. And when I was in Europe, actually, the gallery I was working with, they provided a bed next to my oven, which was so nice. So because at home, that's part of why I have a domestic practice, is because I have to lay down so much to regain strength. And I think like the body's super mysterious. I think sometimes when people think mobility impairment, they just think you can't move. But for myself, I can move. It's often that I lose dexterity and strength very quickly. So I have to move really quickly, and then I have to rest a long time, and then I have to move really quickly, and I have to rest a long time. So it's kind of an interesting cycle. But the gelatin and the paper mache and the cakes, you know, and working with words, text, poetry, it all requires a bit of a rest, especially the gelatin. It has to set up in layers. So I pour a little bit and then I rest, and then I pour a little bit and I rest. It takes a really long time, but I have more time than I have stamina. So the practice really works with my body. And this is a bit about invisibility and disability. You know, on the left, you can see is like me featured in Vogue. And then some of these other images are what's going on behind the scenes with underneath my clothes and in my home. I think one thing is, for when people are really super ill, they often don't go out in public when they're in that state. So unless you enter someone's domestic space, you might not see that private side. But I think I really just wanted to show this so other people with like somewhat invisible illnesses maybe get a bit more grace when they're trying to explain that. And you know, it's not fun to share things like this, but I think it's really important, just so people get a little closer idea of what reality can look like on a day-to-day basis. And the fact that, especially with degenerative diseases, if we are pushed really hard or if we aren't accommodated, this is what can happen really fast. So we might seem fine, or you might see us come to an event and we might seem fine, but when we get home, this is what's happening. Before we, you know, when we were at home for months before, this is what's happening. So the risk is really high when people with chronic diseases aren't accommodated. It can cause these types of flare-ups, and they can cause bodily harm. And yeah, I just really wanted to give some insight on what that looks like, because for myself, I'm quite privileged. I can hide what's happening to me a lot of the time, and sometimes I can't. But that's not the case for everyone. So I just wanted to talk a bit about that. This is another view of my kitchen where I am right now. This is kind of what I was just talking about, how the pace is completely different, and it goes into this psychedelic kind of time warp when you're producing. And you know, there's a level of research that goes into it as well, trying to find tools like these spoons, fork, comb. These are all things I've used in periods of my life, not decorated like that. But I often, especially when I was young, I just threw them out because they were so stigmatized. I didn't want like my partners or my roommates seeing stuff like that. So part of this project in making these ergonomic devices was how to make them beautiful, how to make them transparent, how to make them reflective of what my body's going through and what so many other people are going through. And here's more views of the work. So these do shrink and biodegrade. They turn into almost like a bioplastic. At the end of this, I'll share with you some of the sculptures I have on my table here. So depending on how fast they dehydrate, they can crack, but and they can, they can break and they can get cloudy, but it just depends on the humidity and the temperature and the wind, like the airflow and the duration of time you leave them at those. So it really depends, and the amount of moisture and the amount of gelatin that's put in the solution. This is called the inflammatory Asclepian comb. Asclepian, sorry. This is a ergonomic knife, ergonomic spoon, again the diclofenac fork. The spoon has neurological medications, and the knife has surgical tubing. And this is a medical commode. I called it the bone dust commode. Yeah, I really love working with gelatin because it's a natural material, but also it is bone. It's made of collagen. It's bone dust. It's often gelatin because bovine gelatin smells a lot and it has a very different consistency, and it's quite a bit darker. It's not as clear. So this is kind of an homage to medical toilet. Again, another domestic medical device that is kind of dehumanizing and unbeautiful, but they used to be beautiful. I did a lot of research on them, and there were a lot of really, really nice medical commodes, and it wasn't until the invention of plastic and the sanitization purposes that they started switching them over to these mass-produced objects. But I would really like to make custom devices for people so they can have beautiful furniture in their home that's also helpful for their health. Domestic commode of gelatin. This is, I wanted to show this to show how the work documents. So this is a bowl in the middle and another sculpture on the left. The gelatin is almost the same. It's actually the same blend, but because of the lighting on the right-hand side, this is a sculpture that was at New Image Gallery, I think in LA. Yeah, this is quite a few years ago, but the lighting and the yellow and the black floors just make it completely different. Working with reflective, translucent materials can be really fun. Obviously, I love it so much, but it's also sort of challenging when you want to document it. It's way better to see in person. It can really pick up on whatever's around it. But they're the same blends of gelatin. This is a project I did for the city of Vancouver, and these are actual gelatin sculptures that I made, and then I photographed, and then I superimposed them onto plaques. And then I also imposed the text on top. I would have liked to just make a plaque and put the gelatin on the plaque, but gelatin's such a soft material. I can work with it when my hands are really bad, but working with wood is a lot harder. So for me to carve and burn the wood and stuff, it was too physically challenging. So I just photoshopped and made my own three-dimensional gelatin and made it into a two-dimensional image. And they were called the disability pride plaques because there's very little talk about disability pride. There's parades for so many other forms of marginalization, and I think New York has a pride parade for disability, but I would really like to get to a place where people think of disability with pride and not with pity or fear. So there was a series of those. Here's two more.
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Roughly, just as a time reference.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a pine CBD cake, and this is more my edible practice. Again, for accessibility purposes, I don't want all my work to be super heady. I want to make things that kids can enjoy, and maybe people who aren't interested in art can enjoy. These are a couple little gelatins. This is an installation at Simon Fraser University, Tellurian dinner.
You don't have to rush now, Sharona. You can also go a little bit longer, but just roughly so we have time to ask questions as well.
So these are also paper mache plates that I made. Oh, there's a typo there. But yeah, so here I table, so I just used Home Depot boxes. And then these are gelatins with hardware, industrial hardware. And these are prints that I made. I usually do all my writing in bed with my eyes closed, actually, just using talk to text. And then I edit it later. So these were all done when I was immobile. And then when I'm more mobile, that's when I usually do graphic production or physical production. But it's interesting because sometimes I will commit to two different tasks and my body can't do both. Like when my body's mobile, I have to use it for sculpture. And when my body's immobile, I have to use it for writing. So it can be a bit tricky fulfilling both sides of things when my body's misbehaving. But this one on the right talks a bit about medical linguistics, and this talks about the bio-ritualism a bit more. To me, bio-ritual is, accepting the reality of pharmaceuticals and making it something that feels meaningful to yourself. It can feel really harmful to consume pharmaceuticals that are being mass produced. But also when they do protect us and help us so much, we have to give, honor and gratefulness to that too. So it took me a long time to get there to a point where I can actually thank my medication for what it's doing and not resent it. I think that's really important, to be able to do what's best for yourself and not resent what you're having to go through is really important for just radical acceptance and self-acceptance. Oh yeah, social media is ethylene glycol. This is kind of a joke that I have. Ethylene glycol, it used to be used to poison people as in windshield fluid, and it tastes really sweet, so people wouldn't know it's poison. And I often think about that with social media, in that there's so many positive things. It can be so lovely, but then there's also these poisonous sides to it that can really harm us if we're not careful. But I think that goes for anything, like the pharmaco-industrial complex as well. So this is a t-shirt graphic that I made. It says the pharmaco-industrial complex may be toxic, but ableism is venomous. And this, I go into a bit about cybernetic craft and disability and propaganda. So I started an account using social media specifically for to kind of separate my practices. I made paid technologies to be this highly, beautiful, simple project that could be easy to consume, very digestible. And then I made hot crip. I divided off or prismed off my advocacy, and I made these kind of memes that were propaganda and brought satire into the world of disability. I know a lot of other people are doing it or have done it, but I really just felt like it was therapeutic for me to make jokes about things that I didn't feel I could ever really speak about. So I made 800 memes over the course of a year. And I really wanted to mess with the algorithm, as at that time I wasn't really seeing so much discourse about disability. And I think it's really important that we joke about disability, because that's what makes us human. And I remember when I first started making memes, people would ask oh, I feel bad, I don't want to laugh at it. I was oh, well, to not laugh with someone is kind of dehumanizing in itself. I only ever really heard that from non-disabled people, but eventually caught on. They started to realize, okay, disability is not this totally segregated part of society. We can all learn about each other and still poke fun at each other sometimes, and also talk about things that need to change in society. So this is a little graphic that I made. I have so many graphics. I just wanted to share some. I haven't used it for anything. It says disability uprising policy. And it's just kind of telling people to advocate, don't play it safe, advocate, make mistakes. Speaking about this, sometimes that can be very stifling, and we all have to make mistakes to keep going forward. I really believe that, and so much of my practice is super messy, and that I make mistakes all the time. So here's a bit of my memes. I made a lot of memes of just things I heard people say in the community. It wasn't actually that hard to make that many memes because I kind of had a lifelong bank of hearing people say really harmful things. I was like, okay, I'll just make this into a meme. And here's a few. Same woman who rejects the feelings of disabled people cries when she can't poo. Like, there's this whole separation and then how they want to interact with a disabled person's life. And there's all these stigmas around that. So, and I just really like framing access and accommodations as safety boundaries, because safety boundaries or just boundaries are such like popular lingo right now. And I feel in the disability world, like a lot of us do whatever we can to make ourselves relevant within that lingo. If people understand boundaries, but they don't understand accommodations, maybe we'll just, you know, link them and people will start to understand that it's a really important boundary. Accommodations are serious boundaries. This is more work from Kingsley. It's the new psychedelia work that I was referencing earlier. And then, yeah, this is a quilt, and these are ceramic plates with UV printing, and this is paper mache and a gelatin mold. It's actually quite large. They're all quite large. Another photo. And this is another ritualism. It's called the amoebic self-portrait of pharmaceutical preservation methodologies. And yeah, those are like some sweet buns. I had always been like so afraid of the medications that I took growing up, and I always had to hide them, and they always said keep away from children, even though I was a child taking them. So when I got older, just to like let go, I just started kind of playing with them. It wasn't something I ever did growing up. It was just something I started doing like recently for this practice, for this new psychedelia of industrial healing practice. And this is another plate. It says TNF, DNA, IL-6, RNA velocity, chimeric transmission, and interleukin vulnerability. And this is a little bit more like behind the scenes of the sculpture making and how the paper mache starts out, and then how I start adding the drips to it. And it's usually just made with like cardboard and wood and then just paper. It's a little t-shirt. This is just stuff from my studio I threw in. Ready, willing, and disabled. I think it's important to talk about like the economy of opportunities with disability, because oftentimes opportunities are given, but we're too ill to take them. And with gig work, working as an artist, we often miss them and they don't necessarily come back. So when we're working lots of really small jobs and our income is reliant on a lot of little jobs, when we miss a big chunk of time, it can be hard sometimes to rebuild those opportunities or rebuild those relationships with institutions or galleries when you really just were too ill. And I know it's also so competitive that there's always someone waiting to fill your place. So I made these stickers that say ready, willing, and disabled, just to give a bit of light to that. And these are more graphics. Be your own lord and jester till your death, dear flower. And those are opioids. Those are poppy flowers. Good things rise, don't fall for now, forever is bending. Sickos don't quit. This is more of the bio-ritualism, the new psychedelia of industrial healing. They are shrines that I was doing every 24 hours. I did it for over 100 days. So the antibodies would come out of the fridge and I would document them before injecting them. And then these are just the little graphics, again, that I'm going to be working with probably for my next book. But yeah, love and support disabled folks day by day by day. If you're looking for a fixer-upper, my disability may not be for you. And this is actually the last slide. So I can show you just the last objects that I have here.
Then you have to stop your screen sharing at the bottom.
Share.
Wait a second, Sharona, okay. There was a bit of a hiccup there. Okay, let's try. Okay.
Here is a dehydrated sculpture. So this is gelatin and potassium sorbate that I've dehydrated. And these are tapioca pearls. And there's some alcohol swabs in there. But it's quite hard. It's like quite plasticky. And here's another one. So step up to the dimensional dahlia plate. This is a test. So you can see it's rusted a bit. But yeah, this is an antibody injection, but it was already used, so it's an empty. And then this is potassium sorbate. So this I mixed with gelatin to preserve it. This is used in like gummy bears and stuff. But some of the sculptures I don't preserve. Some of them I let decompose depending on the purpose and the location.
Amazing.
Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. I think that's everything.
Thank you so much. We'll give an online applause here for your really amazing presentation and so deeply personal presentation. I remain really, really impressed and moved. And I would actually like to directly go into a few questions, or maybe further exploring what you've already kind of started to talk about, and maybe come back to the notion of the like social construction of disability, which is a big topic of yours.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
And also maybe the inherently, maybe even violent, like normative conceptions of body and mind, no? Also, which then either exclude everything or end everyone not fitting these norms, or deems them as somehow in need of cure or treatment.
Yeah, the idea that something's wrong with you.
That something is wrong with you.
If you're not able normative. That's huge for me. Like, I've always felt like I had to be better, and the word better can be so painful. It tells you you're not enough, right? So I think like in the realm of art and institutions, I think what really needs to be asked is like, how can those institutions be better at accommodating, you know? It shouldn't be on fitting a standard, but like changing that standard and making it morph. And basically the social construct of disability is that society changes and not the person with the disability, and that society makes space. But the hard thing about that is the advocating, like for myself, every time I work with an organization or institution, I have to go through a pretty similar process every time, where I have to educate about my needs. I have to educate about why those needs are important. I have to educate about why other things won't work, because usually when I ask for accommodations, other things are offered to me that aren't what I'm asking. You know, usually, unless stated otherwise, usually most people with disabilities know what they need. And, you know, asking around what we need isn't really helpful, because it actually puts more labor on us to continually explain. And the more we are doing labor to explain, the more othered we are. So that's still centering able normativity if we're consistently being othered by explaining. So that's with the Axioms of Care book. Like, I really want to get into more of that. And it's part of the book also is going to have disclosure trauma responses, where we can log like, okay, I disclosed this thing about my body and this was the person's reaction. Because sometimes when we're dealing with so many different people, especially as freelancers, we're dealing sometimes with, you know, like we're working with 20 different people at a time, with a few people at each organization, and it can be hard to tell where you feel safe and where you don't. Maybe one person at the organization feels safe and the other person doesn't, and there's not really a process to work through that emotionally. And when we're working as advocates or activists, we also don't have a HR department. We don't have that kind of like, we don't have a workplace counselor. We don't have that. So the labor that goes into advocating is pretty heavy. And it's uncompensated usually. Not always. I think people are starting to be a bit more aware of the educational labor and the emotional labor of educating about disability, but I think still culturally people feel if they're listening to anyone talk about disability, they're doing someone a favor by listening. I don't think we're really there where people think, oh, I'm listening to someone talk about disability, they're doing me a favor by teaching, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that really answers the question, but
no, yeah, it does. I mean, I was aiming for the kind of the social construction of disability, and I think when you showed it in all of your works, and also how these constructs and these norms or normative conceptions that are also all like able normative, they basically affect everything from how and where we live, how we work, how we learn education, how we heal. So it's, I think you opened up like how broad the influences are. And I was reminded when you said that society needs to make space actually for that. There's the exhibition Crip Time that's in Frankfurt right now, in which you're participating. There's one quote that's kind of the heading quote by an artist called Johanna Hedman. She says there, "You don't need to be fixed, my queens. It's the world that needs the fixing." And it kind of, I guess, plays into this, what you just said, that it's not us, it's like society that needs to make space.
Yeah, and also when you are ill or disabled, we often need help, you know, and that can make us vulnerable too. Where people offer to help us, we really need help in that moment, but really that person wants to fix our lives. You know, that can happen sometimes, and I think that's where accommodations can get tricky, where sometimes people want to take those accommodations too far and, you know, come into your home or start getting involved in your like personal life. I think I remember this actually in high school a lot. There were disability, like I was in a separated class for disability, and there's just the power dynamic of helping someone can sometimes go way out of hand really fast, where they think, oh, you need help with this small thing. Well, because you need help, that means I should be telling you how to do everything. So like, I think leaving people with their dignity and like giving dignity and respect to people who need help is really important, and that's something that's not often taught. I think most of the time growing up we're taught that people younger than us need help, people who like aren't like quote unquote intelligent need help, or the idea of help, like I still use the word help, but I try not to, because it can be infantilizing in itself. So like I try to use the word assistance, or I'm trying to reframe my relationship to disability too, because for so long I always viewed anything anyone did as help. But I started thinking of it as this, like, help is when you open the door for someone, or help is when you pick something up that someone dropped. Accommodating someone is very different. Giving access to someone isn't helping them, it's being just humane, and then also with disability, like I'm trying to recontextualize my relationship to it as well. People often say disability barriers. What are your disability barriers? Or you can't access the workplace, or you can't access your kitchen because of these disability barriers. Well, for me, a disability barrier is when my organs aren't working or my joints, but a structural barrier or an institutional barrier is very different. There's disability barriers very specific to our bodies and how our bodies function, but structural barriers aren't just, because when we keep calling all these barriers disability barriers, we're putting the onus and the problem back onto the people with disabilities, and it really is structural barriers.
And I mean, if I can ask the question, but how can ables be, let's say, better allies in going forward? Let's talk about like disability forward.
I think like maybe not being, it's tricky, because for me, I don't want people to be so serious all the time. Sometimes I feel because disability is serious, everyone's super serious with me, and that gets really like exhausting. That's part of why I started Hot Crip, was to like joke around, but people took it really seriously again, even though a lot of it's like polemic, like and it's like satire, and it's kind of over the top. It's not so extreme, but I felt when I was doing Hot Crip that I needed to, it was supposed to be over the top. The way I navigate the world is a little bit different than that account, but the point was to have this kind of like persona in the world that is speaking so brash about disability, but I really want people to have like humility. I think that's really important, and just like really humane curiosity. Like a lot of us don't want our lives picked apart, but having healthy questions. I think the most important thing is that you're not asking us like why we have disabilities or how our disabilities work. All allies need to know is how they can make our life easier. I like to think of discrimination as making a marginalized person's life more difficult than it already is because of their marginalization. So when I think of it that way, it's really, I think the onus is just on finding out how to be an easier, like a more accommodating friend, or how to be an easier support, because this is a really good question, because some people offer support to me and I say no, and it's really difficult for me because I really need that support, but I know they're not equipped, or I'd have to spend so much labor teaching that's just not comfortable. So I think like self-education is really important. There's so many books. Like I can recommend some after, actually. I have like a little list. And I think just, self-education, I think very few of my friends growing up knew anything about disability. And even now, it's not really something that people are like incentivized or compensated for knowing about. It really mostly only benefits disabled people, and that cannot be the greatest incentive sometimes to non-disabled people, unfortunately.
Talking about,
sorry.
I'm sorry, talking about marginalization, I was just thinking that I feel that the last, make it 5 years or so, we came across like a much, so how can I put it, like a much needed discourse of like vulnerability and empowerment and of emancipation from really deeply, deeply ingrained, like century-old and institutionalized forms of marginalization, of exclusion, and of discrimination, and also to a broader and seemingly unaffected part or parts of society about topics like, I don't know, sexual abuse and harassment, if you think of the Me Too movement, or racially motivated violence and institutional racism, think of Black Lives Matters, and also against, I feel, the backdrop of the current pandemic, more recently also the topic of health, in particular actually mental health, is my observation. And do you think that like you aim also to deprogram this internalized or institutionalized ableism is maybe like the next long overdue step?
I do.
In this kind of systemic change within contemporary society?
I think like I definitely think it's time, and I think it's happening. It's also extremely complicated because it is intersectional, you know, so there's other things to address first maybe, and then the thing about disability that I think is like an incentive for people to care about is that everyone is susceptible to it at any moment in time, any age, like anything, everyone is susceptible. And yeah, that doesn't really dawn on people sometimes. They think it's like, it's still, there's a lot of othering going on. I made a shirt, I wish I included it in the slide, but it said ain't nothing uglier than othering one another. Because like, you know, it's a really simple way to put it. Like if you're asking a disabled person too many personal questions, you're kind of othering them, you know. So I think just like trying to stay humane about it, but I hope that that movement comes. I have to say though, like a lot of the disabled people in my life still don't feel like it's ever going to come, and it's really hard because I'm trying to advocate for that, and the people who feel that way, they're not advocating and they don't want to because they don't want to put themselves out there, which I totally respect. But it can be hard when I hear things like that, like this hopelessness, and then I'm like, no, like there's so many people working on it. I know all these advocates and all these people, but I think often when people are just so ill or isolated from their disabilities, it can be hard to see these other realms of change, you know. And a lot of them I've noticed are institutional and academic. They're not necessarily happening in like places of poverty and stuff, you know, where it's an educational process, I think, and it takes a while to travel around.
I was also thinking, this may be my last question before I open up to the students, that a lot of also the movements that I just mentioned, they were all like co-driven by social media. Let's say social media played an important role in this one. And you showed some of the memes that you worked on in Pay Technologies and your hot Crip account. That was Instagram then, no? Where you like literally used memes to dismantle ableism. And you told us a little bit about what motivated you to start this, but what do you think digitization enables us with regards to accessibility today or in the future?
Oh, it's so incredible. Like when I was growing up, I was completely analog, manual. Like I didn't have a computer. I mean, I was given a computer for accessibility, but it didn't have internet, and it was so heavy, I couldn't use it. That's how it was back then. But I didn't have like a computer that I could use with the internet until I was 20. And the first computer I was given was actually from a hospital, from a rehab hospital that I was living in. And they taught me voice recognition software, and I really didn't want to use it. And I was so like purist. I was like, oh, I just want to write with a pen, you know, but I couldn't write. So for me, it's been extremely instrumental, but it's taken some time for people to take it seriously. You know, when you're talking into your phone, people just think of like techies in San Francisco or Silicon Valley. And I think that dehumanizing aspect of tech shouldn't apply to people who are using those things to do human things, you know. I think sometimes like so many technological advances help me and other people with disabilities, but there's all these purist ideas or whatever, an artisanal life with no technology, and yeah, I'm like a big fan of tech, but I don't know how to use it very well. I mean, even putting this slideshow together, I've never learned how to do a slideshow. I was gonna speak about that, I forgot, but I didn't even graduate high school till I was 27. Like I was consistently dropping out, just because the educational system didn't suit my body or any of my lifestyle at that time. Yeah.
It's been really amazing, and yeah, as I just said, like, thank you, like, really from my heart, thank you, Sharona, also for sharing your vulnerability, and I think it has been extremely empowering, if I may say so, and motivating. And I think it's also precisely our vulnerability and our fragility that generally speaks makes us sensitive, makes us perceptive, and also different from one another. And sensitivity also isn't weakness. It just means that you pay attention. And I would like to end with a quote from you, from the Axioms of Care. To care, one must be careful. Maybe that's something that we can all take home with us tonight. So thank you again for being with us today. And if you indeed could share with me the various links to the literature that you mentioned, that I can share it with the student group. And thank you all, guys, for being with us here today for these 2 hours. It's been amazing, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week, then with an architect, with Samir Bantal. So thanks again to everyone. Goodbye, stay safe and stay healthy and stay well and do your thing. And yeah, have a great week. Thanks again.
Aw, thank you.